Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be finishing our reading of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie by May Gibbs. I hope that all of you have enjoyed this reading as much as I have. As I've mentioned a couple of times, it's a story that brings me back to my childhood, a simpler time in life where the joys of nature and friendship were sufficient for my imagination to run wild. I hope that it has brought you similarly back to a more innocent time in your lives. When last we left our heroes, they had been encountering some rather rummy things. Mr. Lizard and Snugglepot were searching for Cuddlepie, having been told that he had gone to the city. But their information was bad, for in fact they were given that information by the bad Banksia Men, who hoped to separate Snugglepot and Cuddlepie and stop them from foiling their plans. So it is there that we pick up with Snugglepot in the house of the artist. Let's jump straight to the story and see what happens next. And here we are again, for the final time, with Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. Let's find our page and continue the story. Yes, this is where we left off, with the gumnut artist. One day, the artist asked Snugglepot to come into his studio to see a picture he had painted for the important exhibition soon to be opened. There is a prize for the livest-looking picture, and I want to get it. As he said this, he threw open his studio door, and there, seated in a chair, comfortably leaning back and smoking his pipe was, who do you think? Why, old Mr. Lizard himself, as large as life. Snugglepot rushed in and was just about to embrace him when the artist caught him by the neck. "What?" he cried. "You would spoil my picture, you rat, you bat, you native cat." And he shook Snugglepot till his eyes jumped. "Oh, oh," cried poor Snugglepot. "I thought it was alive. It is my lost friend." Then, out from behind a long green curtain stepped old Mr. Lizard. Snugglepot was overjoyed. There was a great merriment at the artist's home that night. Dr. Hocus Stickus came round to dinner, and everyone declared the picture to be lifelike. Now, it happened that another artist in Big Bad had decided to get the prize for the alivest picture, and, most strange to say, he had chosen for his model a Banksia Man. There was a great excitement on the opening day. All the artists and other queer people went to see the pictures. When Snugglepot saw the portrait of the Banksia Man, it looked so real that he felt quite nervous. The great eye seemed to blink at him. He stood rooted with horror. Then, suddenly, the picture burst open, and out from the frame sprang the Banksia Man, almost on top of him. With a terrible yell, the Banksia Man seized Snugglepot by the legs and, scattering the people right and left, he ran from the gallery. The artist rushed out after him, shouting, "Murder! Help! Stop him!" But the Banksia Man's long legs covered the ground so quickly, and he turned so many different ways that no one could catch him, and soon the shouts died away in the distance. All this time, poor Snugglepot's head was going round and round, and he nearly fainted with the pain of being carried upside down. It's very cruel to carry any live thing upside down. Remember that. Suddenly, the Banksia Man darted into a doorway and down a long passage, climbed a lot of steps, groped through a long, long, dark tunnel, and came out into a cave at the end. In the cave were a number of Banksia Men, smoking, arguing, and playing bones. When they saw Snugglepot, they all gathered round. "Got him at last," said the Banksia Man, panting. "Is he alive?" grunted one, poking Snugglepot with his horrible bony finger. "Is he what?" sneered the Banksia Man, tossing Snugglepot into a corner. "What'll we do with him? That's the question." "The slimy little sinner," growled one. "String and ring him," said another. "Rack and crack him," snarled another. "Bust and rust him," croaked a monster with 3 eyes. "Stick him on a bull ant's nest. They'll kill him, and the crows will come and pick his bones," squeaked the smallest and ugliest of them all. Throw him to the bulldogs," shouted all the Banksia Men, jumping about in wicked glee. "Give him a dose first," muttered one of them. So they opened poor Snugglepot's mouth and poured some horrible juice into it, and that was the last thing Snugglepot remembered. Now, old Mr. Lizard, being a very sporting fellow, had sneaked off to the races instead of going to the picture gallery with Snugglepot and the artist. When he came home, his cap on one side and swinging his cane jauntily, he was amazed to find Mrs. Artist in tears and Mr. Artist saying the most dreadful words. No sooner had the terrible news gone into his ears than he dashed out the door. Old Mr. Lizard was a sensible person, so he argued with himself as to which way the Banksia Man would most likely have gone when he ran from the picture gallery. And sure enough, he guessed well, for he passed a doorway he espied, just inside, upon the ground, a little green cap. It was Snugglepot's. He knew it by the plans sticking inside. In less time than it takes to tell, old Mr. Lizard was standing outside the Banksia Men's cave, breathing hard and listening. "Well, come on," he heard one say. "If we're going to cop that slimy lizard, we must be going." Mr. Lizard flattened himself against the wall. In his hands he held a heavy stick with a knobby end. The first Banksia Man came out into the dark passage. Whack went Mr. Lizard's stick, and down went the Banksia Man. "One," muttered Mr. Lizard under his breath, kicking the Banksia Man to one side. Out came another Banksia Man. Whack went Mr. Lizard's stick. Down went the Banksia Man. "Two," whispered Mr. Lizard. Out came another Banksia Man. Thud went Mr. Lizard's stick. Down went the Banksia Man. Out came another Banksia Man. Whop went Mr. Lizard's stick, and down went the Banksia Man. 2 came out together. Whack, whack went Mr. Lizard's stick. 6, murmured Mr. Lizard, swinging his stick. No more Banksia Men came, not a sound in the cave. Mr. Lizard peeped in, not a soul there. Yes, just one, poor little Snugglepot, lying still and white, his hands and feet tied and his eyes closed. Mr. Lizard stooped down. He started back. "Oh, Daddy Bones," he groaned. "Alas, alas, why did I go to the races?" Then Mr. Lizard flew into a passion of rage. Weeping and saying dreadful words, he pulled all the Banksia Men into a heap in the middle of the cave and set fire to them. Then, lifting Snugglepot tenderly in his arms, he fled from the place, moaning and weeping as he went. And that really was the end of those wicked Banksia Men. Oh, how very sweet. I love those races on kangaroos with the koalas and everyone else in their finery. I wonder who will win. All this time, Cuddlepie had been living happily with the fish folk, enjoying the wonderful sights and almost wishing he were a fish folk himself. Ragged Blossom was so glad to have him. Anchovy and John Dory were so kind to him. Abelia was so wonderful. She was taller than Anne and wiser than ever. One day, while she was holding a council, for she was queen of the fish folk now, there was a great commotion in the palace, and a prisoner was brought before her. Throwing himself down, the Banksia Man pleaded for mercy. "What has he done?" asked Abelia. But without waiting for an answer, she rose from her throne and hurried to her thinking room. She had scarcely counted a lapful of pearls when she sprang up, and spilling the pearls as she ran, rushed into the council chamber. "The villain!" she cried. "Throw him to the sharks. He and his black shadows have taken our Ragged Blossom. They have cast her into the bottomless sea where the days are as nights. I have seen it. Throw him to the sharks. Away with him." At these words, the councillors turned pale, for in fish folkdom no thought is so dreadful as the fear of the bottomless sea. "There is just one chance," said Abelia. "Send Cuddlepie to the fish sauce shop." "Alone?" gasped John Dory. "Yes, alone," commanded Abelia. A shudder ran through the council room. "Give him his words and let him go," said Abelia. Oh, and here we can see Abelia, no longer baby Abelia, but now queen of all the fish folk, and the bad Banksia Man, who has thrown himself down at her mercy. A little while later, Cuddlepie, trembling but brave, pushed his way through the great swing doors of the mysterious fish sauce shop. As he went in, the shaggy head of a Banksia Man peered out of a window. At the same moment, a little black and white fish swam into a niche just above the doorway. Oh, can you see him there? Just hiding very well. It was Frilly. "Say the words," called a loud voice as Cuddlepie entered. Cuddlepie started back. On each side and in front of him were the open mouths of hungry-looking fish. Rows of sharp teeth glistened all round him. "Say the words," repeated the voice. Cuddlepie was stiff with fear. He couldn't remember one word, yet he had to say them over and over all the way. "Too late. Eat him," shouted the voice fiercely. But just as the open mouths came at him, Cuddlepie made a great effort and began. "She stood at the door of the fish sauce shop, welcoming him in." At the first word, the hungry fish turned. At the last word, they vanished. "Pass on," called the voice. Cuddlepie, still trembling, but still brave, went through a huge archway of shark's teeth and found himself in a beautiful white hall made of coral. All round the sides ran a little balcony, and in the middle of the floor was a deep black hole. As Cuddlepie stood there, wondering what the voice would say next, a strange and wonderful fish swam round the hall and stopped before him. On its head, brilliant flashing lights of phosphorus, and harnessed with a bright red saddle, from which hung a little sharp spear. "Mount the messenger, take the spear, and be prepared to descend," called the mysterious voice. Cuddlepie climbed into the saddle. "Hold tightly to the messenger, and say the words," commanded the voice. Cuddlepie repeated the words. At the sound of the last word, the messenger dived into the black hole. Clinging to the harness with one hand and clutching the spear in the other, a terrible noise in his ears and a dreadful fear in his heart, Cuddlepie descended down, down, down into the bottomless sea. All was black dark. Cuddlepie shut his eyes. He could not bear to look at it. Presently he opened them. All round him were flashing lights, and coming straight at him was a huge sea monster with fiery lights along his body and round his head, and the most terrible eyes and the longest teeth that Cuddlepie had ever seen. Just as the great thing came rushing upon him, Cuddlepie lifted his spear and drove it right into the monster's throat. With a terrible gurgle, it sank away into the dark. But before him was another great sea monster. Cuddlepie uttered a cry, for there, standing in its open mouth, all lit by the phosphorescence, stood little Ragged Blossom, holding out her arms to him. In a flash, Cuddlepie had snatched her out, and the messenger turned his flashing headlights upwards. They rose and rose until suddenly they came right into the wonderful hall again. As they came to the edge of the balcony, the great voice called, Say the words. Now, Cuddlepie was so excited at having found Ragged Blossom that he stammered out, She stood at the door of the fish horse shop. Welcome in. Immediately there was a terrific explosion, then a black darkness. The sea was calm, and only a few rippling wavelets licked the small brown rock on which Ragged Blossom lay drying in the sun. Inquisitive seabirds circled about her, while under the water little Frilly swam round and round the rock in an agony of mind. He had waited patiently outside the fish sauce shop for Cuddlepie. Then came the terrible noise, and Frilly found himself thrown up to the surface of the sea. When he recovered from his fright, he swam about looking for Cuddlepie, and, spying along the top, he saw the seabirds clustering about the rock. It must be Cuddlepie, he thought. When he found little Ragged Blossom lying there, so still, he tried to leap onto the rock, calling, She will dry! She will dry! A little stormy petrel, hovering above him, heard and understood. With a wail of sympathy, he fluttered to her, caught her dress in his bill, and pulled her into the sea. With a shout of joy, Frilly caught her, and calling to his little friend Steady, who was just swimming past, and I guess that means this here is Steady. Together they carried her home. Great was the rejoicing when they arrived with their burden. Ragged Blossom threw herself into Anne's arms, crying, Where is Cuddlepie? Here I am, said Cuddlepie, kissing her. What was the terrible noise? She asked. It was a sea quake, answered Abelia. The fish sauce shop was blown apart, and all the Banksia Men and the giant octopus have been thrown to the sharks. Who did that? Asked Ragged Blossom, shuddering. I did, said Abelia. How did Cuddlepie escape? Asked Ragged Blossom. A good question, I think. It was the messenger, answered Abelia. He is my own wonderful fish. You see, I laid a trap to catch the wicked octopus. Why did I get blown up? Asked Ragged Blossom. It was an accident, dear little jellyfish, said Abelia, smiling. They will happen. Alas, strange to tell, not many days later, when Cuddlepie and Ragged Blossom were walking in Anne's lovely garden, another accident happened. A great fish came rushing over the wall, his dark nose shining and his eyes glistening. Swift and straight he darted at the children, and before they could even cry out, he had opened his huge jaws and swallowed them up. Then with a swish of his tail he turned and rushed away, away, away. It seemed a long, long time to Ragged Blossom and Cuddlepie, but it couldn't have been more than a few moments, because almost immediately after the greedy fish swallowed them up, he spied the bait on the end of Billy's line and snapped it up. Got him, shouted Billy. Haul him in, said his father, "A beauty," chuckled Billy as he swung the fish into the boat. "You'll do nicely for lunch," said Billy's father. "I'll prepare him while you row in." Suddenly he sprang up. "Great Scott!" he exclaimed. "What?" cried Billy, craning forward. "Oh, father!" he gasped in amazement. "What can it be?" "Oh, father, how wonderful!" For there, in the middle of the opened fish, sat two tiny little creatures. It was Ragged Blossom and Cuddlepie. While Billy and his father stared with eyes and mouth wide open in utter astonishment, the little things jumped out and ran along the side of the boat. "Catch 'em! Quick, father, catch 'em!" shouted Billy. "Fill the specimen bottle, and we'll put 'em in," said his father, and without waiting for lunch, Billy and his father hurried home to show everyone their wonderful find. Ragged Blossom and Cuddlepie clung together in the bottle as the great humans stared at them. Every now and then the big people shook the bottle to make them move, and their poor little heads were quite sore with being bumped against the sides. "Just because we're little, they think we can't feel," said Cuddlepie, glaring fiercely at the huge face of Billy, who simply did not know any better. At last, night came, and the humans all went to bed. "I hate humans," said poor Cuddlepie, pushing at the heavy lid. "Come and help me, Ragged Blossom. It's moving." After much struggling and straining, they managed to lift the lid and clamber out. Then they slid down the tablecloth, ran along the floor, climbed up the window curtain, and in a moment were out on the sill of the open window. The moon was shining. "Shh, shh, shh, shh." It was the voice of a possum walking along the bough of a gum tree, growing close beside the house. "Mr. Possum," called Cuddlepie, trembling lest the humans should hear him. "Hello," called back Mr. Possum, lowering himself by his tail to see who it was. "Take us into the tree," cried Ragged Blossom. "We're so frightened. The humans will catch us so quick." Reaching out his hands, Mr. Possum swung them both into the tree and took them safely to his little house in the bush nearby. By this time, Ragged Blossom was so worn out and miserable that she fell upon Mrs. Blossom's motherly breast and wept. If only dear Mr. Lizard would come and take us home," she sobbed. "If only he were here." Now, the strangest of strange things happened. The door opened, and in walked old Mr. Lizard. Oh, and who do you think was with him? Why, Snugglepot. When Mr. and Mrs. Possum saw all their visitors throwing their arms about each other's necks, and talking and laughing and kissing and dancing about, they held up their hands in surprise. "Get something to eat and drink, my dear," said Mr. Possum, lighting his pipe. It was nearly bird-rise when Snugglepot, Cuddlepie, and Ragged Blossom mounted Mr. Lizard's back and said good-bye to the kind Mr. and Mrs. Possum. After a long and happy journey, the travellers arrived at Gumnut Town, and great was the rejoicing and great the amazement when the nuts and blossoms heard of the wonderful adventures. "What became of all the nuts who went with you?" they asked Cuddlepie. "Alas, That is the sad part of the story. No one ever knew. Snugglepot built a new big house and took Cuddlepie and Ragged Blossom to live with him. Mr. Lizard went off, scouring the countryside for little Winky Jerboa. He found him lost and nearly starving. He brought him to Snugglepot, who rejoiced to see him and asked him to be his head gardener and live with him for always. Little Jerboa stuffed his tail into his mouth to hide his tears. He was so happy. But Ragged Blossom missed her baby Obelia. "She's not a baby. She's grown up," said Cuddlepie. "But I'd like a baby," said Ragged Blossom. "Well, sting and wing me," cried Snugglepot. "You shall have one. Put on your hat and we'll go to the baby shop." It is the habit with the Gumnuts to gather up any little homeless bush babies and take them to the baby shop, so that anyone who wants to buy an extra baby or two may go to the shop and buy them. Ragged Blossom was delighted, but when she got there, she found it impossible to choose. "I love them all," she sighed. "Then have the lot," cried Snugglepot. "I've plenty of money," he added, slapping his cap. "When you and Cuddlepie were under the sea, Mr. Lizard and I found the Banksia Men's treasure." "We'll buy the nurse, too," suggested Cuddlepie. "Good route," said Snugglepot. And so they did. And here we can see the baby shop, an idea with which I'm not quite sure I agree, but it seems to solve a problem for the Gumnuts. And here is the end of the story of little Obelia. There wasn't really much about her in it, but what there was is very important. For if it hadn't been for the baby Obelia, Ragged Blossom wouldn't have stayed behind with the fish folk, and all these wonderful adventures would never have happened. This is the third book of the tales of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. The end.